Leon Edwards doesn't control fights. He doesn't overwhelm opponents with volume, force scrambles, or pin people into positions they can't escape. And yet, again and again, the result is the same. The fight ends on his terms. This is the contradiction that confuses fans and frustrates opponents. Because when you watch Leon Edwards, it rarely feels like he's taking something away. It feels like nothing dramatic is happening at all. And that's exactly where the decision is being made. Most fighters try to win by control. They push pace, dictate space, impose rhythm, and turn momentum into inevitability. Leon Edwards does something far more unsettling. He allows the fight to breathe. He allows opponents to move, to reset, to feel involved. And inside that apparent freedom, their options begin to shrink. Not suddenly, not violently, quietly, until urgency no longer works and pressure no longer creates advantage. This video is not about skills or techniques. It's about decision power, about why fighters leave rounds against Leon feeling like they were present, active, and still somehow irrelevant. Why game plans don't collapse, they just stop producing results. Why opponents look composed on camera, yet walk away knowing they never found the moment they were waiting for. Leon Edwards doesn't need to dominate exchanges to shape outcomes. He doesn't need control time to control direction. He doesn't chase mistakes, he waits for the fight to narrow itself. And when that happens, the opponent isn't beaten into submission. He arrives there logically, step by step, until the clock runs out and the realization hits too late. By the end of this video, the question won't be why Leon Edwards wins fights. The question will be why so many fighters never realize the fight was already decided, even though nothing ever looked out of control. The first mistake fighters make against Leon Edwards is assuming control has to look visible. Pressure, volume, cage dominance, activity. Those are the signals fighters are trained to read. Against Leon, those signals still exist, but they stop meaning what fighters expect them to mean. You can be moving forward, throwing more, even holding center position, and still feel like the fight isn't responding to you. That's where the problem begins. Leon doesn't contest control in the traditional sense. He doesn't rush to reclaim space. He doesn't panic when pushed backward. He doesn't immediately counter every advance. Instead, he lets opponents spend energy proving something that won't convert. Fighters feel productive early. They feel involved. They feel like they're setting things up. And because nothing is being violently shut down, they commit deeper to a plan that is already losing effectiveness. This creates a delayed feedback loop. Normally, fighters rely on instant signals to adjust shots landing, reactions changing, pressure yielding results. Against Leon, those signals are muted. A clean strike doesn't open a sequence. Forward pressure doesn't trigger retreats. Time passes without escalation. The opponent is active, but the fight remains static. And when activity doesn't create leverage, fighters don't know whether to push harder or pull back. Most choose to push. That's where Leon's real advantage emerges. He doesn't resist pressure, he absorbs it without conceding consequence. He gives just enough ground to avoid exchanges turning chaotic, just enough engagement to prevent disengagement from resetting the fight entirely. The opponent feels responsible for making something happen, while Leon quietly controls what can happen. This is why early rounds against Leon often look deceptively close. Fighters believe they're gathering data, building momentum, setting traps, but momentum requires response, and response never comes the way they expect. By the time they realize pressure isn't bending the fight, they've already spent the most valuable resource in championship-level competition: initiative. Leon hasn't taken control yet. He doesn't need to. The opponent has already committed to a framework where control is measured by effort instead of effect. And once that mental model is locked in, the fight stops being about who dictates action and starts becoming about who decides outcomes. Once fighters realize that activity isn't translating into advantage, a subtle shift takes place. Against Leon Edwards, the problem is no longer about imposing control, it's about finding relevance. Opponents begin to sense that they are present in the fight without influencing it. They are moving, striking, adjusting, yet nothing seems to tip the balance. This is where urgency usually enters. And this is exactly where Leon neutralizes it. Most fighters rely on urgency as a weapon. When a round feels close or momentum stalls, they increase pace, shorten distance, or force exchanges to create separation. Against Leon, urgency doesn't produce chaos, it produces exposure. Every acceleration tightens the margin for error, while Leon remains operating at the same measured tempo. The opponent speeds up, the environment doesn't. This mismatch creates frustration without panic. Fighters don't feel outmatched, they feel unanswered. Their actions don't provoke reactions. Their risks don't generate consequences. Leon stays composed, selective, and surgically responsive. He doesn't interrupt rhythm by dominating exchanges. He interrupts it by refusing to let escalation dictate terms. As urgency rises, decision quality drops. Fighters begin to stack actions, strikes without setup, pressure without positioning, volume without structure. None of it collapses immediately, which makes it harder to diagnose. There's no clear mistake to fix, just a growing sense that the window to decide the fight is shrinking. Leon exploits this by staying exact. He doesn't need to outwork opponents. He only needs to outtime them. He chooses moments that carry disproportionate weight, a clean counter, a well-timed kick, a brief positional win, then lets the clock do the rest. Each of these moments doesn't dominate the round, but they puncture the opponent's sense of progress. Time keeps moving. Options keep narrowing. This is the trap. Fighters believe urgency will save them, but urgency requires reaction. Leon doesn't give it. He lets opponents accelerate into diminishing returns while he continues deciding which moments matter. By the end of the round, nothing looks out of control. But the fighter chasing control now realizes something uncomfortable. The fight is no longer asking for effort, it's asking for precision, and precision under pressure is not something urgency can provide. By the middle of the fight, the real shift against Leon Edwards isn't tactical, it's psychological. This is the point where opponents begin to self-regulate. Not because they're tired, not because they're hurt, but because they've learned through repeated non-results that doing more does not equal gaining ground. And once a fighter starts editing himself mid-fight, the outcome begins to harden. This is where Leon's fights quietly get decided. Opponents stop committing fully to sequences. Combinations shorten. Follow-ups disappear. Pressure becomes symbolic rather than functional. Fighters still advance, still throw, still look busy, but every action now carries a hidden break. They are no longer asking, "Can I make something happen?" They're asking, "What happens if this goes wrong?" That question is lethal at the elite level. Normally, champions rely on instinct when rounds tighten. Instinct fills the gaps when plans break. Against Leon, instinct feels unsafe, because nothing he does signals chaos. Opponents don't feel justified gambling. There's no obvious opening to crash into, no moment screaming urgency, just a steady environment where mistakes would be unforced and therefore unforgivable. So, fighters hesitate, not dramatically, just enough. This hesitation compounds. Each half commitment reinforces the next. Fighters start choosing clean options over effective ones. They favor safety over consequence. And because Leon doesn't visibly contest this shift, opponents convince themselves they're being smart, disciplined, patient. But patience without leverage is just time passing, and Leon is perfectly comfortable letting time work for him. Here's the critical mechanism. Leon doesn't punish mistakes aggressively. He punishes overextension selectively. That distinction matters. Fighters don't fear getting countered every time they act. They fear that the wrong action will finally matter. And since they can't clearly identify which actions those are, they reduce all of them. Output drops not from fatigue, but from uncertainty. At this stage, the fight stops feeling like a competition of skill and starts feeling like a test of judgment under ambiguity. Leon thrives here because he never needs to guess. He's not searching for control, he's waiting for confirmation. A slight reach, a rushed entry, a moment of impatience that finally breaks the self-imposed restraint on the other side. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't swing the fight wildly. It just locks it in. A clean strike, a decisive exchange, a visible punctuation that reframes everything that came before it. Suddenly, the opponent isn't chasing control anymore. He's chasing time that no longer feels available. This is why Leon Edwards doesn't need dominance to decide fights. By the time opponents realize they've been managing risk instead of creating outcome, the decision has already been made. Not by force, by hesitation. At this point in the fight, opponents finally understand what's happening, and that understanding arrives too late. Against Leon Edwards, realization is not empowering, it's paralyzing. Fighters recognize that they are operating inside limits they did not consciously accept, yet somehow agreed to through dozens of small, reasonable decisions. Nothing dramatic forced them here. That's what makes escape so difficult. This is the moment where fighters face a brutal choice: continue operating inside a shrinking framework, or break it violently and accept whatever consequences follow. Against most opponents, that choice favors escalation. Pressure can flip momentum. Risk can force exchanges. Chaos can reset the fight. Against Leon, escalation doesn't reset anything. It simply exposes the fighter to moments that carry permanent weight. Leon's greatest advantage here is that he is not overcommitted to any narrative. He hasn't sold dominance. He hasn't demanded urgency. He hasn't framed the fight as something that needs to be seized. Because of that, when the opponent finally feels behind, there is no obvious lever to pull, no clear adjustment that hasn't already been neutralized by time and positioning. Fighters begin to test desperation in controlled doses. A harder push here, a longer combination there, a slightly riskier entry. But partial desperation doesn't work. It only sharpens Leon's responses. He doesn't match intensity, he clarifies consequence. A well-timed counter, a clean kick at the exact moment of forward motion, a brief positional win that instantly halts momentum. Each of these moments tells the opponent the same thing: full commitment will be punished more efficiently than cautious engagement ever was. This creates a psychological deadlock. The fighter knows he must do more, but also knows that doing more increases the chance of a decisive loss. He's no longer fighting Leon directly, he's negotiating with probability, and probability, inside a cage, always favors the fighter who has already accepted the pace of the fight. What's crucial is that Leon never appears to close doors aggressively. He simply keeps them narrow. There is always a path forward, but it's so tight that using it requires abandoning safety entirely. Fighters hesitate at that threshold, not because they lack courage, but because elite competition teaches restraint. Leon exploits that education perfectly. By the late rounds, this tension becomes visible. Fighters look composed but constrained. They're present but muted. They're active but ineffective. Viewers often misinterpret this as a close fight, but from inside the cage, it feels very different. One fighter is choosing moments, the other is hoping moments appear. This is where the fight truly gets decided. Not by volume, not by control time, not by obvious dominance, but by who is forced to gamble without information. Leon never takes that gamble. His opponent eventually must. And when that happens, the fight doesn't explode, it resolves. Leon Edwards doesn't close fights by breaking opponents. He closes them by making every remaining option feel worse than the last. And once a fighter understands that truth, there is no adjustment left that doesn't risk everything. By the final rounds, the fight against Leon Edwards no longer feels like something that can be won, only something that can be lost decisively. This is the last and most important phase of Leon's system. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's irreversible. The opponent understands the situation clearly now. Time is nearly gone. The scorecards feel uncertain at best, and yet the path forward looks worse than the position they're already in. This is where Leon's approach fully reveals itself. He hasn't controlled the fight in a visible way, but he has controlled the cost of action. Every remaining option carries a disproportionate downside. Push harder, and you walk into precision. Slow down, and the clock finishes you. The opponent is finally forced to confront the truth that has been building since the opening minutes. There was never going to be a moment where control could be taken, only moments where outcomes could be decided, and Leon has been choosing those all along. Late fight urgency against Leon doesn't look explosive, it looks awkward. Fighters rush without structure. They enter range without preparation. They throw combinations that don't connect to position. And Leon doesn't respond by matching intensity. He responds by ending conversations, a clean strike that lands heavier because it arrives unopposed, a perfectly timed counter that erases seconds of effort in an instant, a calm disengagement that lets time keep doing its work. What makes this phase so devastating is how calm Leon remains. There is no visible scramble for dominance, no sense of survival. He's not fighting the clock, he's aligned with it. Every second that passes without chaos is a victory. Every forced action from the opponent is an invitation to decide the fight with a single, high-impact moment. This is why late rounds against Leon often feel inevitable in hindsight. Not because the opponent lacked heart or conditioning, but because the structure of the fight was never designed to be overturned late. The fighter chasing control realizes that control was never the currency that mattered. Decision-making was, and by the time that lesson is learned, the remaining decisions are all bad ones. Leon Edwards doesn't overwhelm fighters at the end. He simply allows the consequences of earlier restraint to mature. The fight doesn't slip away from the opponent, it closes around him. Quietly, precisely, and without giving him a clear moment to resist. Leon Edwards doesn't win fights the way fans are trained to recognize. He doesn't dominate space, suffocate opponents, or overwhelm them with activity. Instead, he does something far more difficult to counter. He lets fighters operate just enough to believe they're involved, while slowly removing their ability to change the outcome. That's the distinction. Control is about force. Decision is about timing. Leon doesn't need to own every exchange. He only needs to decide which ones matter. And once that balance shifts, the opponent is no longer fighting Leon, he's fighting the clock, his own hesitation, and the consequences of choices that felt reasonable at the time. This is why Leon Edwards remains so difficult to deal with at the highest level. Not because he's invisible, but because he's misleading. He doesn't look like he's taking anything away. Yet round by round, option by option, the fight becomes narrower until the result feels settled long before the final horn. So when people ask why Leon Edwards wins without control, the answer is simple and uncomfortable. Because control was never the point. The fight was decided the moment his opponent agreed to play a game where effort didn't equal influence. And once that agreement is made, there is no clean way out.